That vehicle, she said, pointing a single, perfectly manicured but somehow threatening finger at my driveway, is in violation. Her name was Brenda Miller, and she was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac. She stood on my freshly cut lawn, her body encased in a blindingly bright pink tracksuit that seemed to violate the neighborhood's own muted earth tone aesthetic. Her voice carried the grating authority of someone who had never held any real power but had spent a lifetime demanding it. I was watering my hydrangeas, a simple pleasure I'd promised myself after 2 decades of service. I kept the nozzle trained on a wilting blossom and answered without looking at her. Which violation would that be, Brenda? Article 7, Section C, subsection 4, she recited, her voice swelling with the pride of memorization. All vehicles parked within public view must display a valid, current year HOA parking permit on the lower left-hand side of the windshield. She paused for dramatic effect. Her lips pursed into a triumphant smirk. Your dark blue sedan does not have one. I've checked. Twice. I straightened up slowly, turning off the hose. The sedan in question was a Ford Taurus. It was meticulously clean, utterly unremarkable, and parked perfectly centered on my concrete driveway. It was also technically still government property, part of my terminal leave transition package, a detail I saw no reason to share. I see, I said. My voice was calm, level. In my previous line of work, a calm voice was a weapon. It unnerved people who expected panic or anger. I don't seem to have received a parking permit, or the welcome packet for that matter. Not my problem, she snapped, the smirk tightening. The rules were mailed. Ignorance is not a defense. You have 24 hours to either display a permit or remove the vehicle from public view. That means inside your garage. If it's still here tomorrow morning, it will be towed at your expense. And believe me, she added, leaning forward conspiratorially, our contracted towing company is not cheap. She turned on her heel and marched away, her sneakers squeaking on the pavement. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She saw a quiet man in his late 40s, a new homeowner who kept to himself. She saw a soft target. This was her first and most critical mistake. She hadn't declared a simple administrative action. She had declared war. And I had spent 22 years as a senior agent in the United States Secret Service, planning and executing campaigns against threats far more significant than a petty tyrant in a pink tracksuit. The principles, however, remained the same. That evening, the campaign began. The first phase of any operation is reconnaissance. You define the battle space, you identify the threat, and you gather intelligence. My battle space was the estates at Maple Creek. My primary threat was Brenda Miller, HOA president. The objective was not just to win the immediate conflict over the car, but to neutralize her power structure entirely. I started with the HOA bylaws she had so proudly quoted. A quick online search of county records brought up the full document. I printed all 112 pages. With a cup of black coffee and a set of highlighters, I began my analysis. I wasn't just reading. I was cross-referencing, looking for inconsistencies, overreaches of authority, and procedural vulnerabilities. For 3 hours, my living room became a tactical operations center. The coffee table was littered with paper. Article 7, Section C, Subsection 4 did indeed exist. But Subsection 5, which Brenda had conveniently omitted, stipulated that new residents had a 90-day grace period to come into compliance. I had closed on the house 41 days ago. Her threat was baseless, a pure intimidation tactic. This was a significant piece of intelligence. It told me she operated not on the actual authority of the rules, but on the perceived authority she could project onto residents too scared or too busy to read the fine print themselves. This was her fatal mistake. She assumed I was like the others. By midnight, I had a complete breakdown of the HOA's legal framework. I also had a list of every board member, their addresses, and their tenure. I ran background searches through a few publicly accessible databases. Nothing criminal, but revealing patterns emerged. Brenda had been president for 6 years, unopposed. The treasurer was her brother-in-law. The secretary was her best friend from her yoga class. This wasn't a community board, it was a junta. The next step was physical and electronic surveillance. I reactivated a professional-grade security system I'd installed upon moving in. It wasn't the cheap consumer kit you buy at a big box store. This was a networked system of low-light, high-definition cameras covering every approach to my property, with audio pickup sensitive enough to record a conversation on the sidewalk from my front porch. I saved the footage of Brenda's visit, tagged it Exhibit A, and backed it up to a secure cloud server. The following morning, I was outside trimming my hedges at 8 a.m. sharp. Brenda did her morning patrol at 8:15. As predicted, she marched down the street, clipboard in hand. She stopped in front of my house, her eyes locking on the sedan, still parked exactly where it had been. A flicker of rage crossed her face, quickly replaced by smug satisfaction. She made a great show of taking a photo with her phone, then scribbled furiously on her clipboard. She peeled off a bright orange sticker and strode up my driveway. I didn't say a word. I just kept trimming, the rhythmic snip-snip of the shears the only sound. I watched her slap the sticker onto the driver's side window. It was a final warning, printed in aggressive red letters, stating the vehicle would be towed within the hour. She shot a triumphant glare in my direction and marched off to continue her reign of terror. She had just escalated. She moved from a verbal threat to a physical act against my property. The sticker itself was a form of vandalism, its adhesive notoriously difficult to remove. More importantly, she had provided me with time-stamped, video-recorded evidence of her violating the HOA's own grace period policy. I saved the new footage as Exhibit B. I let the sticker sit. I didn't need to move the car. I needed her to make the next move. I needed her to call the tow truck. While I waited, I shifted to Phase 2, human intelligence. I needed to know if I was her only target or if this was a pattern. A quick scan of the neighborhood's unofficial social media page was a goldmine. Complaints, veiled and anonymous, were everywhere. Fines for trash cans left out for 61 minutes instead of 60. Demands for lawn maintenance that bordered on horticultural obsession. Threats over holiday decorations deemed tacky by an unelected arbiter of taste. Brenda was not just a bully, she was an insurgency, terrorizing the local populace. And every insurgency has a weakness. It relies on the fear and isolation of its victims. The key to dismantling it is to build a counterinsurgency, to unite the populace. I started with my next-door neighbor, an elderly man named George. His lawn was immaculate, but a small whimsical garden gnome stood beside his birdbath. I'd seen Brenda gesturing at it angrily a week prior. I walked over with a pitcher of lemonade. "Hot one today, George," I said, offering him a glass. He accepted, wiping sweat from his brow. "They never seem to get any cooler," he sighed. We talked about the weather, his prize-winning roses, and then I guided the conversation. "That's a fine-looking gnome," I said, nodding toward it. "My daughter would love that." George's face darkened. "Enjoy it while you can. The Queen has decreed it unnatural yard ornamentation. Got a $25 fine yesterday. Said if it's not gone by Friday, it's 50. "Did she cite the bylaw?" I asked, my tone casual. "Something about maintaining aesthetic uniformity," he grumbled. "Said it was in the book." "I have a copy of the bylaws, George," I said quietly. "There is no provision governing decorative gnomes. There's a section on structures, but that's legally defined as something with a foundation like a shed or a gazebo. She's making it up." He stared at me, his eyes wide. "Are you sure?" "Positive. I can print you out the relevant section. She's counting on you not checking." I paused, letting it sink in. "Has this happened before?" For the next hour, George unloaded. A litany of petty abuses, of fines invented from whole cloth, of constant harassment. His wife, he said, was terrified of checking the mail. They were retired, on a fixed income. The constant stream of $25 and $50 fines was causing them real financial stress. I listened. I took mental notes. When he was finished, I said, "George, I'm documenting every interaction I have with her. Every letter, every threat. I think you should too. And I think we should talk to some of the other neighbors. There's strength in numbers." A flicker of hope appeared in his eyes. It was the first crack in Brenda's wall of fear. Over the next week, I became the quiet revolutionary of Maple Creek. I spoke with the young couple 2 doors down, The ones fined because their son's basketball hoop was, according to Brenda's tape measure, 1.5 inches over the regulation height limit. A regulation that didn't exist. I met the single mother across the street who was cited for her car leaking oil on her driveway, a stain that was there when she bought the house. I talked to the family who was ordered to repaint their front door because their chosen shade of beige was too vibrant. Each story was the same: a fabricated rule, a threat, a fine, and a victim who felt isolated and powerless. I collected their stories, their pictures, their crumpled, tear-stained citations. I helped them draft formal dispute letters, all sent via certified mail, return receipt requested. I taught them the power of a paper trail. I was building a coalition, an army of the aggrieved. We created a private, encrypted group chat. Information began to flow freely. Sightings of Brenda's patrols, photos of her peering into backyards, audio recordings of her abusive tirades. My dossier grew from a slim folder into a 3-inch binder, meticulously organized and cross-referenced. It had sections for each family, copies of their illegal fines, photographic evidence, and sworn affidavits I had helped them prepare. The centerpiece was the section on the towing company, Brenda's Bulldogs, as we'd nicknamed it. My research into them had been fruitful. The company was owned by a man named Al Russo. His business had a D rating with the Better Business Bureau and a string of lawsuits for predatory practices in other counties. More importantly, financial records I acquired through a contact in the state's corporate commission showed something interesting. Al Russo had co-signed a personal loan for Brenda Miller 3 years prior. A loan for a luxury SUV she now drove on her little patrols. It wasn't definitive proof of a kickback scheme, but it was a very bright red flag. An arrow pointing directly at a conspiracy to defraud the residents of our community. This changed the scope of the operation. This was no longer a simple case of HOA overreach. This was potentially criminal. Mail fraud, for sending fraudulent fine notices through the USPS. Wire fraud, for using electronic payment systems to collect on those fines. Extortion. This required a different level of engagement. I began drafting a formal complaint to the state attorney general's office, but I knew that would be a slow-moving front. I needed to end this decisively. I needed to bait the trap. The orange sticker was still on my sedan's window, faded and peeling after a week of sun. Brenda was growing impatient. Her daily patrols became more frequent. She'd park across the street and just stare at my house, her frustration a palpable force. She was a predator who couldn't understand why the prey wasn't running. She couldn't comprehend that the prey was, in fact, the hunter, and she was the one being stalked. The community was buzzing. The certified letters were arriving at her house, one after another. The official disputes were piling up. Her authority was being challenged, not by one resident, but by a coordinated, documented resistance. She was losing control, and like all petty tyrants, her response was to escalate. I knew she was going to call the tow truck. It was her only move left. It was the nuclear option in her tiny arsenal. She needed to make an example of someone to crush the rebellion. My sedan was the symbol of defiance. It had to be taken, and I was ready. If you've ever dealt with a bully drunk on a tiny drop of power, hit that subscribe button, because you are going to want to see exactly how a well-laid trap is sprung. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and if you have your own story about a queen of the neighborhood. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was monitoring a directional microphone aimed at the street from my home office window. It was a piece of surplus equipment from my old job, designed to pick up conversations from 100 yards away. I heard her car pull up. I heard her on the phone. "Yes, it's me again," she said, her voice sharp and angry. "The blue Ford Taurus. It's still here. I want it gone. Now." There was a pause. I don't care what he said. I am the president of this board, and I am authorizing the tow. "Get your truck over here, Al, immediately." The trap was sprung. I made a single phone call. Not to the police, not to a lawyer. I called a number I knew by heart. "Dispatch," a flat, professional voice answered. "This is Agent 6. I have a possible situation at my location. Code 8. Code 8 wasn't an official code. It was an informal one, a call for assistance from a former colleague. It meant, "I'm not in immediate danger, but things are about to get interesting, and I require a federal presence. Acknowledged 6. Stand by. I hung up. I walked to my front porch and sat down in a rocking chair with a tall glass of iced tea. The show was about to begin. 10 minutes later, Brenda's Bulldog's towing rumbled into the cul-de-sac. The truck was a greasy, rust-pocked beast, and at the wheel was Al Russo himself, a large man whose physical presence was clearly meant to be an intimidation tool. He backed his truck up to my driveway with a loud, obnoxious series of beeps. Brenda stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on her face. Several neighbors, alerted through our group chat, were now watching from their windows and porches. Al lumbered out of the truck. He didn't even look at me. He immediately began hooking up the sedan. The heavy chains clanked against the undercarriage. This was a critical moment. He was now physically attempting to seize the vehicle. I took a slow sip of my tea. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. My calmness was a foreign concept to Brenda. She expected shouting, pleading, a confrontation. My silence was unnerving her. I could see it in the way she kept glancing at me, her triumphant smile faltering. "Got a problem, buddy?" Al grunted in my direction, yanking a chain tight. "Not at all," I replied evenly. "Please, continue." This was not the response they expected. My compliance confused them. But it was a calculated move. I needed them to complete the act. I needed the truck to be physically attached to the sedan, demonstrating a clear attempt to remove it. Just as Al finished securing the chains and walked back to the cab of his truck, 2 black Chevrolet Suburbans turned silently into our quiet cul-de-sac. They were immaculate, with tinted windows and small, discreet antennae on the roof. They didn't have sirens or flashing lights. They didn't need them. Their presence alone commanded more authority than any local police cruiser. They moved with practiced, deliberate speed, boxing in the tow truck. One Suburban blocked its front, the other its rear. The cul-de-sac was sealed. Brenda's jaw went slack. Her face, moments before flushed with victory, was now a mask of confusion. Al Russo froze with his hand on the truck's door handle. The doors of the Suburbans opened in unison. 4 men in dark suits and earpieces emerged. They were my former colleagues, my friends. The lead agent, a man named Mark, whom I'd worked with for over a decade, walked directly toward Brenda. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of training. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. "Ma'am," Mark said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "I'm Special Agent Mark Corrigan with the United States Secret Service. We seem to have a situation here." Brenda stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Secret Service?" she stammered. This is an HOA matter. This car is being towed for a parking violation." Mark glanced at the car, then at the tow truck, then back at her. He didn't smile. "Ma'am, you are attempting to seize an asset of the United States government. That vehicle is equipped with sensitive communications and counter-surveillance equipment." This was a slight exaggeration of the truth, but in these situations, a tactical overstatement is a valuable tool. Tampering with it or attempting to move it from a secure location is a federal offense. The color drained from Brenda's face. She went from pink to a pasty, sickly white. "Government? Property? He lives here. He's just some guy." Mark turned his head slightly and looked at me, sitting on my porch. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. "That man," he said, turning back to Brenda, "is a decorated retired senior agent of this service, and you, ma'am, have spent the last several weeks harassing him." The revelation hung in the air. The other neighbors, who had slowly emerged from their homes, began to murmur. George was standing on his lawn, a huge grin spreading across his face. The queen had been checked. Al Russo, the tow truck driver, wisely put his hands up in the air. "Hey, I was just doing my job. She called me. She authorized it," he blurted out, already trying to distance himself from the sinking ship that was Brenda Miller. "Your professional relationship with Ms. Miller," Mark said, without looking at Al, "is also of great interest to us, and to several other agencies." He pulled a phone from his pocket. "We're going to secure the scene. I would advise no one to leave." The situation had been contained. The immediate threat was neutralized. Now, the main offensive would begin. This wasn't just about a parking violation anymore. It was about dismantling a corrupt enterprise, piece by methodical piece. I stood up from my rocking chair, my iced tea finished, and walked down my driveway. I held out the 3-inch binder. "Mark," I said, "I believe you'll find this interesting reading." He took the binder, his eyes scanning the neatly organized tabs. Affidavits, financial records, correspondence. He looked up at me. "You've been busy, Six." "Retirement project," I said. Brenda was hyperventilating now, her eyes darting between the suited agents, the neighbors who were now staring at her with open contempt, and the sedan that had been the catalyst for her downfall. She had thought it was a battle over a parking spot. She was about to learn it was a campaign for the soul of a community, and she had brought a plastic clipboard to a gunfight. While Mark's team secured the scene, a new set of vehicles arrived. These were not the discreet black Suburbans of the Secret Service. These were marked units from the local police department and, more significantly, a dark sedan with government plates that I recognized as belonging to the FBI's local field office. Mark had made the call. The information in my binder, particularly the financial links between Brenda and Al Russo, had elevated this from a federal property dispute to a multi-agency criminal investigation. An FBI agent, a sharp woman in a practical blazer, took possession of my binder. She flipped through it, her expression growing more intent with each page. She looked from the binder to Brenda, who was now leaning against Al's greasy tow truck for support, her pink tracksuit looking absurdly out of place amidst the grim seriousness of the federal agents. The public humiliation was a critical phase of the operation. Brenda's power was built on perception, on the illusion of unassailable authority. Watching her crumble in front of the very people she had terrorized was a strategic necessity. It broke the spell. You could see it in the faces of the neighbors. Fear was replaced by anger, then by a cathartic sense of vindication. George walked over to me, his eyes shining. "I'm taking the gnome on a tour of the neighborhood later," he whispered, clapping me on the shoulder. The FBI agent, whose name was Davenport, approached Brenda and Al. "Brenda Miller? Al Russo," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet tension. "We need to ask you a few questions. Downtown." "I haven't done anything wrong," Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is my neighborhood. I am the president." "Your tenure as president," Agent Davenport said coolly, "appears to be over. As for not doing anything wrong, we have dozens of sworn affidavits and substantial financial evidence that suggest otherwise. We're looking at multiple counts of mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy." Each charge she listed was like a physical blow. Brenda flinched. Al Russo, the big, intimidating tow truck driver, suddenly looked small and scared. He began talking immediately, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to cooperate. "It was her idea," he blurted, pointing a thick, greasy finger at Brenda. "All of it. The fines, the towing contract. She said it was all legal. She gets a percentage of every tow and every fine we collect for her. It's all in the books." He had just confessed to a kickback scheme in front of a dozen witnesses and a federal agent. It was a rookie mistake, born of pure panic. Brenda stared at him, her face a portrait of betrayal. Her only ally had turned on her in an instant. She was completely, utterly alone, surrounded by the consequences of her own arrogance. Agent Davenport nodded slowly. "Thank you for that confession, Mr. Russo. You both have the right to remain silent." She gestured to the local police officers who had been standing by. "Please place them under temporary detainment." The sight of Brenda Miller, the Queen of Maple Creek, being placed in handcuffs was something no one in the neighborhood would soon forget. The metallic click of the cuffs echoed in the silent cul-de-sac. She didn't resist. All the fight had gone out of her. She was just a woman in a ridiculous pink tracksuit, her reign of manufactured terror at an ignominious end. As she was led to a police car, she looked at me one last time. Her eyes weren't filled with anger anymore. They were filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. The quiet man with the hydrangeas. The man she had dismissed. She finally knew. The systematic destruction of her empire continued over the following months. It was no longer my direct operation, but I provided support and testimony as needed. The FBI, armed with my initial dossier and Russo's confession, executed a search warrant on Brenda's home and the HOA's main office, which was a spare room above her garage. They found everything: a second set of books detailing the kickback scheme, shredded documents that forensic accountants painstakingly pieced back together, emails and text messages between Brenda, her brother-in-law the treasurer, her friend the secretary, and Al Russo, outlining their conspiracy in damning detail. The scope of their corruption was staggering. For 6 years, they had been systematically defrauding the residents. They had embezzled over $200,000 from the HOA's reserve funds, using the money for personal vacations, car payments, and home renovations. The fines they levied were not just a tool of power, but a source of illicit income. The towing contract with Russo was predatory by design, with inflated fees that were split between him and Brenda. The state attorney general's office launched its own investigation, prompted by the dozen certified letters I had helped the neighbors send. They found that the last 3 HOA board elections had been fraudulent. Brenda had been discarding ballots that didn't vote for her slate and replacing them with fakes. She hadn't been an unopposed president. She had been an illegal one. The legal fallout was a cascade of indictments. Brenda Miller was charged with mail fraud, wire fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and embezzlement. Al Russo faced similar charges, along with violations of state towing regulations. The treasurer and secretary were charged as co-conspirators. Faced with a mountain of evidence, they all took plea deals. Brenda, the ringleader, received the harshest sentence: 5 years in a federal prison. Her brother-in-law and friend received lesser sentences, including probation and significant financial restitution. Al Russo lost his business license permanently and was ordered to pay back every illegal towing fee he had ever collected from our neighborhood, with interest. He declared bankruptcy within a month. The court ordered the complete dissolution of the existing HOA board. A special master was appointed to oversee new, fair elections. George, my neighbor with the garden gnome, was unanimously elected the new HOA president. His first official act was to hold a neighborhood barbecue and pass a new bylaw, which he called the Gnome Freedom Act, officially permitting all forms of whimsical yard art. The neighborhood changed. The oppressive atmosphere of fear lifted, replaced by a sense of community I hadn't realized was missing. People started talking to each other again. Kids' basketball hoops reappeared. Front doors were painted in a variety of non-beige colors. The estates at Maple Creek finally felt like a home, not a miniature police state. My unmarked sedan remained in the driveway, untouched. No one ever asked about a parking permit again. My role in the revolution was an open secret, a story told in hushed, appreciative tones at neighborhood gatherings. I became, much to my chagrin, a local hero. But all I had done was apply my training. I had identified a threat, gathered intelligence, built a coalition, and executed a plan. The principles of dismantling a petty tyrant are the same as dismantling any other hostile organization. You use their arrogance against them. You arm yourself with facts, and you never ever let them see you sweat. My life returned to the quiet I had sought. I tended my hydrangeas. I drank iced tea on my porch. I watched the seasons change in a neighborhood that was finally at peace. Occasionally, a new family would move in, and at the first neighborhood welcome party, someone would inevitably pull them aside, point to my house, and say, "Now, let me tell you a story about the quiet man who lives there, and why you never, ever mess with his car." Justice isn't always a thunderous courtroom verdict. Sometimes it's the quiet rustle of paper. It's a certified letter. It's a well-organized binder of evidence. It's the slow, methodical process of taking a corrupt system apart, piece by piece, until it collapses under the weight of its own hubris. Brenda Miller thought she was enforcing a rule. She learned she was starting a war she was uniquely, spectacularly unequipped to win. And I finally could enjoy my retirement. The hydrangeas, I noted with satisfaction, were thriving. The epilogue to this story unfolded slowly, like the turning of a page in a history book no one but us would ever read. Brenda's house, a monument to her garish taste, went into foreclosure. The bank seized it to help cover the massive restitution she was ordered to pay. A young family bought it, painted it a tasteful gray, and planted a sprawling, chaotic vegetable garden in the front yard where Brenda's obsessively manicured, chemically treated lawn had once been. It was a victory in itself. The HOA, under George's gentle and reasonable leadership, became what it was always meant to be: a boring, barely noticeable entity that handled landscaping contracts and organized the annual block party. The thick book of bylaws was rewritten. It was condensed into a single, double-sided page of common-sense guidelines that could be summarized as, "Be a good neighbor." The fines vanished, replaced by friendly conversations. The reign of terror was so completely dismantled that new residents had trouble believing it had ever happened. My life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The skills I had honed over 2 decades protecting the nation's leaders were now applied to simpler, more satisfying tasks. The strategic mind that had planned motorcade routes through hostile territories now planned the optimal layout for a rose garden. The attention to detail that had scanned crowds for threats now scanned for aphids on my tomato plants. It was a peace I had earned, but the story doesn't quite end there. About a year after Brenda was sentenced, I received a letter. It was postmarked from a town near the federal correctional facility where she was incarcerated. The handwriting was shaky, a stark contrast to the bold, aggressive script I had seen on her violation notices. I opened it with a certain clinical detachment. It was not an apology. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a rambling, self-pitying tirade. She blamed me for ruining her life. She called me a monster, a bully who had used his secret government connections to destroy her. She insisted she had only been trying to maintain standards and protect property values. In her own mind, she was still the victim. She was incapable of understanding the fundamental truth of her downfall, that her authority was a fragile illusion, and when confronted with actual, legitimate power, it had shattered like glass. She had mistaken the quiet patience of her neighbors for weakness, and my own calm demeanor for cowardice. It was a profound failure of imagination. I read the letter once, then walked it out to my backyard fire pit. I lit a match and dropped it onto the page. I watched as her angry, diluted words turned to black ash and drifted away on the evening breeze. It was the final piece of documentation in her case, and I was filing it away for good. My colleagues from the service still check in from time to time. Mark came by for a barbecue last summer. We sat on the back deck, watching the fireflies, and he told me my binder had become a legendary piece of evidence at the field office. "We call it the HOA dossier," he said with a laugh. "They use it in training now as an example of how to build a civilian-led case against organized fraud from the ground up." I just shrugged. It was a retirement project. He looked around at the peaceful yards, the sound of children laughing in the distance, the soft glow of porch lights in the twilight. "You didn't just win a fight over a parking spot, you know," he said quietly. "You liberated a town." Maybe he was right. I hadn't set out to be a liberator. I had just wanted to be left alone. But when my peace was threatened, I did what I was trained to do. I assessed the threat, gathered my resources, and neutralized it. The scale was different, but the principles were the same. Whether it's a foreign adversary or a neighborhood tyrant, the strategy for dealing with bullies is universal. You stand your ground. You document their crimes. You unite the people they oppress. And you wait for them to make that one, final, fatal mistake. As darkness fell completely, my phone buzzed. It was a message from our old encrypted group chat, which had since become the official but still private neighborhood communication channel. It was a picture from the young family across the street. Their daughter, beaming with pride, stood next to a small, freshly painted sign they had hammered into their lawn. It read, "In this house, we believe in kindness, community, and the right to have a slightly too vibrant front door." I smiled. The war was over. The peace was won. And it was good. My sedan sat quietly in the driveway, a silent monument to the fact that some vehicles, like some people, are more than they appear. And a warning that you should always be very, very careful about who you try to tow.